Hello, everyone. I'm Penny Smith, Warden for the Municipality of the District of Shelburne. Thank you for joining us on this very wintry evening. This last webinar is being held as part of the third round of public consultation sessions for the Municipal Planning Strategy and Land Use Bylaw, and to receive input from you to help us improve these documents. Our facilitator and planner is Crystal Fuller, Senior Planner with Brighter Community Planning and Consulting. And as with the other webinars held, Crystal will give a presentation on the documents and then answer questions from the session chat. So again, thank you for your participation. We truly appreciate your questions and your constructive comments. And I'll now ask Crystal to begin. Crystal?
Good evening, everyone. As Warden Smith said, thank you for coming. Some of you were just coming in the room when she was speaking, but for those of you who missed her comments, they basically were words of welcome and just to explain a little bit about how the evening's going to run. So what we're going to do is, as Warden Smith said, is give a brief presentation, or I'll try to make it brief. And then what we're going to do is we're asking people to put their questions into the question box, which should be at the bottom of your screen, not in the chat box. We're going to leave the chat box open for a few minutes just in case you're having any technical problems or you need to reach out to us, but then we're going to close the chat box down and ask people to put their questions directly into the Q&A box at the bottom. So Pamela Hartwig from Brighter Community Planning is here, and she will act as a facilitator at the end of the session to help moderate the questions. Pamela, can you just make sure that the chat is open for a few minutes, and that if there are technical issues that you can help people through those?
Absolutely, yeah.
The other thing that we didn't mention yesterday, but I want to let folks know, is that all the comments are being read. If they're small comments, we're not going to read them out. They're just going to be for us to look at later. We will respond to questions. If the questions are repetitive, Pamela may jump over those questions and go to a new one to make sure that we hit all the topic areas. This really is an information sharing session so that people understand where the documents are, and I'll explain a little bit more what I mean by that. So with that, I will jump into the presentation. And Pamela, I'm just going to get you to confirm that people can see that.
I can see it.
So if you can see it, others can too.
Yeah, Ning can see it. Yeah.
Thank you. Okay, so what we're going to do tonight is introduce the key changes to the draft at MPS and LUB. And if I'm not looking in the screen, it's not that I'm not looking and paying attention to you, but I have two screens on here, so I sometimes look away to look at the presentation. So we have a new version of the documents for you to, that I'm going to talk to you about tonight. Those are called the version 3 or V3 of the documents. In December, we presented version 2 or V2 of the documents. So there's been a number of changes that have been made as a result of the engagement that happened into December. We're also going to talk to you about the timeline for adoption or potential adoption, at least council consideration of adoption of these documents. So I mentioned at the end of by the end of 2023, there was, in late 2023, early 2024, there were engagement sessions, surveys, one-on-one meetings, there were studies and background reports, which all resulted in information and preliminary drafts. So we had a version 1, which was just internally for us to beat around. And then there was version 2, which was what was presented in December of 2024. So at the end of 2024, we held 3 public engagement sessions in the communities you see on the screen. There was a wind turbine webinar, similar to the format that we're holding tonight, where we just talked about wind turbines. We also had a dedicated email address, which we received 22 emails from the members of the public. And we also had face-to-face meetings with the municipality, with 8 community members at the municipal office. So that's where people booked time with me, and I sat down with them and we went through whatever issues they wanted to go through. Coming out of that, we produced a what we heard report, sort of number 2, that summarized the December engagement and suggested a number of changes that would be made to the documents. And these changes were made, plus other changes. If people have been made suggestions that made sense for the documents, we've been making those on an ongoing basis. So all this has resulted in version 3 or V3, which is what we're talking about tonight. I also want to note that this version 3 engagement session was an addition to what council originally planned, because in December, people expressed some concern that they didn't have enough time to review the documents. With the postal strike, the notifications didn't get in the mail the way that the municipality had hoped. And so to give people more time to understand and look at the documents, these webinars were added to the process to give the public one more chance to review and provide input. So this is the last sort of engagement that happens before the formal engagement occurs as part of the approval process, where council will have to give first reading, and then there's a public hearing that will be held where the public can speak directly to council on the documents themselves. But I'll explain more about that at the end where we talk about next steps. So the feedback and changes generally fall under these 6 items, and we're going to go through each of them in order so that you can understand what the changes were that are being proposed. So the way this is going to work is I'm going to tell you what was in the last version, give you a general overview of what the comments were from the public, and then what changes we're making in version 3 or this version. So these were the policy directions for wind turbines. This was by far the most popular, I guess, discussion point or policy direction when we met with the public in December, and there were a lot of concerns with what we proposed. So what was proposed is that there would be just a setback. I think we had 1 kilometer from people from habitable dwellings, and I'll sort of show you what that looked like, the mapping where we sort of demonstrated the impact. And the wind turbines were not to be permitted south of the 103 or in certain other areas of the municipality. So that was what was proposed. And then we used this to help people understand exactly where wind turbines could go and under certain scenarios. So this is your municipality. So all the colored areas are areas where you cannot put wind turbines under the old policies that we presented in version 2. So it couldn't go in protected areas and municipal watersheds. They couldn't go north of south of the 103. And then they couldn't be within 1 kilometer of a dwelling. So those red areas, so I'm just going to go back again. So you can see the red areas that pop up there. Those are areas where you cannot put a wind turbine if the setback was 1 kilometer. This is what it would look like if it was 2 kilometers, 1.5, 2, and 2.5. Okay. But through the engagement process, we also heard there was a lot of concerns about and people wanting to be involved in the approval process. How do they engage? How do they provide feedback to council for any wind project? So these are some of the concerns we heard. The health and environmental impacts. There was concerns about the negative impact on the rural landscape, the need for decommissioning, mitigation measures, community participation in the approval process. So people were really wanting to have that, and understanding how the communities would benefit. So in the new policies in this version, there's a requirement for the developer to engage with the community and to demonstrate how they do that. We've also added a development agreement requirement for any turbines between 1.5 and 2.5 kilometers from a habitable dwelling. And then over 2.5, then they can just go as of right, which means they can come in and apply for a permit as long as they have an approved environmental assessment. If it goes by development agreement, which is a contract that's negotiated between council and the developer, then there's a mandatory public requirement as part of that. And even if they come in and do it as of right, and for a project over 2 kilometers away, there's still a mandatory engagement that they have to demonstrate. There are now requirements for decommissioning. Someone has asked about bonding. That is not something that municipalities would or probably even can do within the confines of the Municipal Government Act. So there is no bonding as part of that, but there is a requirement for a decommissioning process, and then the requirement for community benefits. So they have to provide some community benefit. So in many other municipalities, that takes the form of money. So this is the policy that's proposed for council to consider, that they have to provide documentation confirming that's engaged with the local community and how any concerns have been addressed. So that will take the form of a report of some kind from them, saying what public meetings, what individual landowner meetings they've had, those sorts of things. A decommissioning plan that requires them to be removed within 1 year after the operations have ceased. They have to provide a site plan showing how it's related to the habitable dwellings and a variety of environmental and cultural features, and the submission of an environmental assessment. So this is quite different than what was proposed in December. Another area that we presented on in December was about coastal hazards. This part of the bylaw has not changed significantly. But the key concerns we heard was restrictions on development rights, so that people can't do all the things they could do now within that coastal hazard zone. Negative impacts on property values and the costs of demonstrating that they can build within that, if that's permitted. And there's not much that's allowed within the coastal hazard zone. Mitigation, what's appropriate. So how do you mitigate the risks if you are a property owner within the coastal hazard zone? There's a requirement for reports from qualified professionals in some case, and there was a questions about what is a qualified professional and how inland flooding is addressed. So in the version 3, we have not changed how we've delineated the water courses. That remains the same. We have not changed anything about a qualified professional. That qualified professional language is pretty common in bylaws across the province and will be determined by the municipality to provide flexibility in case you don't have a wetland specialist, for example, or a hydrogeologist or something, but there's somebody who can who has the qualifications to do it. So it provides flexibility, but it would have to be an accredited individual. There has been questions about pre-existing structures. So if you live within that, does that mean that you can't have your house there anymore? And so pre-existing structures are permitted and can continue as long as they continue to stand. Repair and rebuilding of damaged structures, it's permitted. It's permitted in almost all cases. If it's considered a permitted use, then it can continue again. And then impacts on property values. Property values are not a consideration in planning documents. So that is not anything that you see whenever a municipality adopts a land use bylaw, and the impact on property values. It goes up, it goes down, it moves around. So it is not, there's language about injurious affection, but it is not a consideration in land use planning. It's important to note that most properties only a portion of the property is covered by the coastal hazard zone. So if only a portion of a property is covered by that zone, you just can't build within the coastal hazard area, but you can build anywhere else on your lot. So we had a section previously called economic development, but people quite rightly pointed out that was a bit too narrow, and it's really about creating a positive community, a holistic community. So we've broadened this section out. So previously we talked about industrial lands and creating suburban areas, special planning areas, and utilizing municipal infrastructure. So when people commented, there was questions about the rationale of the special planning areas. So we've expanded that so that there's a better, to help provide more context and understanding of those special planning areas. We added policies about heritage protection. We added tourism policies, housing policies. There was concerns that there were no regulation for solar farms, and we've added those, and more regulation for hydrogen plants. On the issue of hydrogen plants, it's really important to note that there is no plan, there's no application, there's no project that's in the back room looking to come forward. I've been assured that by the municipality. This is just having regulations in place in case someone comes knocking and wants to know how a hydrogen plant could be accommodated, what would the regulations be? So this is being proactive about that, not in anticipation of a particular project. So our changes, we've added policies here for all of these different areas. And we're just going to walk through these a little bit. So there's policies on food security, you can read it, on tourism and on heritage. So there's so on heritage, for example, it's about protecting heritage assets through municipal heritage registry and how that links to tourism and ultimately economic and community development. There's policies on housing and allowing a variety of housing forms within the suburban area designation. And the suburban designation is sort of around Lockport and around Shelburne. And it talks about actively pursuing affordable housing as a particular focus. You can see that there are policies to help support affordable housing projects outside of those two areas I just mentioned, because sometimes you'll have community groups who may have a great idea for a project and get funding, but they're not right in those areas. And the thinking here is you don't want to restrict good, important, deeply affordable housing because it's needed throughout the province. So how can that be accommodated? We have policies on bonusing and homelessness and alternative housing forms. So the market is always creative and robust. So if there's a housing form that's not anticipated within the bylaws, then it can be accommodated through an alternative mechanism. And if you think about it, 20 years ago, nobody was talking about tiny homes, and then they kind of burst on the scene, and all the bylaws, many bylaws had to be updated to accommodate them. So I'm not necessarily talking about tiny homes as what we're trying to accommodate, but it is a flexibility so that any new forms that come that are popular and desired by the community can be accommodated. So the special planning areas, so we added additional language, and it's important to understand what the point of the special planning areas are. And Pamela, I think you were going to close off the chat. I see there's continuing to be more people in the chat, so we were asking people to put all their questions in the Q&A. So I don't know if that's still open, so you just might want to look.
No,
So
it's
just
listening.
okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So the special planning areas are really an area to provide flexibility. What the municipality has said is that they are actively out there looking for or trying to support economic development activities to bring jobs and taxes and opportunities and vibrancy to Shelburne. There's not a particular project they have in mind, but the intent of this area is to allow for projects that support the economic development strategy or any of the municipality. So it's not like anything could just go in this area. It has to be a use that is supported by any studies or strategies adopted by the municipality. We have added language about the noise, air, and visual impact to adjacent residential dwellings. If it requires an environmental assessment, it'll have to go through that process, which then looks at all the biodiversity, it looks at the ecological and environmental impacts. Most of the uses that would not be necessarily require an EA. Those would only be larger scale industrial type ones, but so a housing project, for example, doesn't require an environmental assessment. There's a requirement for a public engagement process to involve a variety of stakeholders. So there was concerns that the public would not be involved in the public in any way here. So this gives an opportunity for the public to be involved. This all happens by this development agreement, contract zoning, sometimes it's called, which means that it's decided by council in a public forum, that there is always a public hearing where the public gets to formally comment, and it's appealable to the utility and review board. So not only is there a requirement for public engagement and public council decision making, but it's also appealable. So if the community has concerns about it, there are opportunities to be involved and actually challenge a decision at the end of the day. There's new policies around hydrogen plants. It is if something happens. So when people wanted, I was informed by the CAO the CIO suggested I make clear that this is actually the hydrogen plant over here. This is adjacent development, and this is Everwind down in Port Hawkesbury. So it's just an industrial picture, but it's just there to sort of give you really to make the PowerPoint more interesting. So it's not meant to alarm you in any way. The point of this really is that development agreements, again, are that contract zoning, that there are requirements for certain minimum distances. These are based on the guidelines that come out federally. If you would like a copy of those, we're more than happy to share those with you, and we can just send an email to our email account, and we can share those with you. It can't be in the coastal hazard area, and it has to demonstrate, and under number 4, that they have environmental protection measures, that the site is suitable, there's emergency response capacity, and that there's a monitoring program. So again, there's no hydrogen project out there waiting to be approved, but it would allow a hydrogen project, if it meets all these criteria, to proceed if council approves it. Other policies this is a sort of change. This is a new service boundary. So a service boundary is areas where the municipality in the future may install water or sewer. In much of this area, there's not, but it's good to have a boundary here so that you don't create sprawling services, which nobody can afford, and also to allow for that growth. So remember, this is a plan for 10 or 20 years, not a plan for the next year. So if services do go in, this area would allow for a little bit more density or higher intensity of uses, like higher density apartments, for example, or townhouses, or uses that would benefit from being on central services. We had, under the version 2, roads and wildfires. A lot of this has remained the same. So this is a bit of an overview of what was in the previous document. What we heard from that was we hadn't addressed what I would call hunting camps, what we've defined as recreational camps. There was questions about the cost and standards of private roads, cost to construct public roads, and concerns about limiting development. So in this version, we've created opportunities for recreational camps, required deeded access to occur. So you don't have to have a road to get to a hunting camp, for example. Private roads. So the costs of private roads are not something that's regulated here. Those are usually standards that are developed separately. So the private roads would meet basically the same standard as a public road, so that is accessible by emergency services and for 911. And the other thing we've done is reduce the area designated as suburban. So previously, we had all these pink areas designated as areas where you could put a little bit more density, but that was just too much. And we received some good feedback on that, and they were right, all the people who said that. So what we've done is we've just reduced it to the areas around the town of Shelburne and a little bit around Lockport. And these are areas where council could consider a little bit more intensity of uses. And if in the future they ever wanted to add, this designation to somewhere, they could. But at the end of the day, what we're trying to do here is really encourage appropriate higher density stuff here and reduce sprawl out in the rural part of the county. During the consultations, we also heard about concerns that the municipality ready with procedures and forms and timelines and processes. The costs of all of this to the municipality, and there was questions about how adjacent municipalities would be notified of any future changes and future developments. So the municipality is actively working on and will be developing planning procedures and enforcement. That's happening at a staff level, so that's not part of this process, but it is a good point, and they are addressing that, and will be over the coming months. And there's going to be something to notify adjacent municipalities of development, so that's in the works as well. So those are the high level changes that we've made to the documents. So just where we are in the process is we had our V2 engagements in December. Now we did pretty significant revisions, and now we're on the V3 document, which we're talking about today. Council will have these documents to consider first reading, which is the first step in the official adoption process, in March. I don't have a date for that. And then if they decide to, they will hold a public hearing and have second reading in April, May, somewhere in that time frame. And then it will be sent off the province for their ministerial review. The first reading, second reading, and ministerial review are subject to council decision making. So those are just estimates of the timeline. But the final draft of these documents that will incorporate any of the questions or comments or concerns that was raised through these two webinars and the meetings I'm having with individuals tomorrow will be available for council for first reading if they choose to hold it in March. So I talked about an email address if you had questions or comments. We'd like to receive all those comments by March 4th. And this is the email address. So please contact us or send along any comments that you may have. And with that, I'm going to turn it over to Pamela, who's going to make sure I answer all the questions that are being posed.
Thanks, Crystal. Yeah, we have some questions here. So I'll start off with the first one. Am I correct that as of right means a minimum of 2.5 kilometers from residences and businesses? That's the first part.
So as of right, so for wind turbines, so anything that is more than 2.5 kilometers away from a habitable dwelling, or that also would be, if it was a store where people were in all day. So a civic number like that, what we're not putting it away from is a shed, for example. But if it's something where people occupy it, then at 2.5 kilometers, it would go, and it's not south of the 103, and it's not within an environmental area or within the watershed, then the wind turbine can go as of right, subject to an environmental assessment. And it has to be 2 times the height away from the property line.
Okay, and there's more to that question. So the other questions are, what would be the drawback to that as a planning guideline? And how did the powers that be arrive at just 2.5 kilometers as the minimum in that circumstance?
Well, 2.5 exceeds most other setback distances. So recently the Minister of Municipal Affairs overturned West Hants 2.5 kilometer setback. I can't speak as to why that occurred, but as per the Municipal Government Act, the minister has the duty to review bylaws and to ensure that they are consistent with the provincial statements of interest. And that 2.5 kilometers in that case didn't hold up. And so in the West Hants case, they couldn't do any wind turbines within 2.5 kilometers of a, I don't know what the language was, habitable dwelling or a civic number or whatever it was. So in Shelburne's case, they are not restricting it to 2.5 kilometers. It's just after 2.5 kilometers, it was determined that it could go as of right and not have to go through a public process because that was sufficient distance away where they didn't need the same land use controls. However, so the minimum setback from a habitable dwelling in Shelburne is proposed at 1.5 kilometers, at least at this point. So a wind turbine could go within 1.5 kilometers, but it can't be south of the 103. It can't be within those environmental areas, and it has to have their environmental assessment, and it has to be 2 times the height from the property line. So hopefully that answers the question.
Okay, thanks, Crystal. I have another question about wind turbine setbacks, so I apologize if it's along the, you've already
No, it's
answered.
perfect.
Okay.
Perfect.
So the municipality of the District of Shelburne has proposed 2.5 kilometers from habitat dwellings and no turbines south of the 103. West Hants proposed 2.5 kilometer setback from property lines, except if the landowner agrees. Minister John Lohr says no, 4 times the height of turbine. Is the draft LUB moot if the province says 4 times the height?
Well, I guess the way I sort of just answered that a little bit. So in the Shelburne case, there can be wind turbines within 1.5 kilometers of a property. It's just of a habitable dwelling. It's just what is the approval mechanism, a development agreement or as of right. So the minimum setback is 1.5. So the question is, can the minister amend or reject that provision? And the answer is yes, they can.
Okay. This next question is, how are you addressing new landowners putting a trailer on it, I'm assuming property, and not having potable water, no septic, polluting the land, no hydro, unsafe heating? Who is monitoring this type of off-grid land use?
So it sort of depends, but if it's a travel trailer, travel trailers can set up because they're temporary, but if it's being permanently habitated, if that's the right word, if it's somebody's living in it, you can't use that as a permanent dwelling. So if somebody's there for a few weeks in the summertime, that's a lot different than somebody who's using it as their home. And you cannot, under this bylaw, use a travel trailer as a permanent home, and it's not permitted in the bylaw. So who's enforcing it? Enforcement is the responsibility of the municipality, and they will be developing enforcement protocols for the new bylaw over the coming months.
Okay, sorry, just 1 second here. Okay, what is the future of the municipal turbine in Lower Sandy Point? Is it still viable?
So I can't speak to that at all because this bylaw is about future uses. So anything that exists legally is is permitted to continue. So looking back, I can't speak to it and I can't address it because I don't know anything about it. But a land use bylaw is about future uses, not existing uses.
Just want to go back a second here. The draft, back to the 2.5 kilometer setback. So the draft says 2.5 kilometers. I just heard 1.5. Did I hear that right?
So it's 2.5 as of right, between 1.5 and 2.5 by development agreement.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, there's quite a few questions here. Does a special planning designation to a zone allow decision makers to forego other regular zoning requirements?
Yeah, development agreements allow flexibility to zoning bylaws. So I'll give you an example of why that makes sense. Let's say that you are, I'm going to give an example that doesn't necessarily work for Shelburne, but is one I run into a lot in other jurisdictions. You're on a bus route in Kings County and you're building an apartment and they require 1.5 parking spaces, but they know they don't want it because they rent all seniors or something. And so you can get a reduction from the mandatory parking requirements through development agreement. It's a negotiated process, right? So the land use bylaw requirements are a guide, but it's the policies of the MPS, which really are what must be adhered to for any development agreement. So development agreements allow council in some cases to say, because of the specifics of the site, I want an increased setback. That's a very common thing because maybe there's a school or a senior center next to it and the minimum setback is 20 feet, but council thinks that it's too noisy for the school or the seniors facility, so they can ask for more. So it's that kind of flexibility that is the strength of a development agreement. And some maybe argue that that's the weakness of it, but that flexibility allows council to do detailed site planning and site approval for a particular development if it's under the development agreement. So the SPAs, I'll review those policies and I can throw them back up on the screen if you don't mind me flipping around here for a second. Wherever the SPAs went to. I can't find them right now. There it is, sorry. Those are the development agreement, specific development agreement provisions. So it has to demonstrate or be aligned with economic development priorities of the region, that noise, air, and visual impacts to adjacent residential development are mitigated through the use of buffering. So implicit in that is if they're not mitigated, then they're not compliant, right? That the EA would be done if it's something that requires an EA, that the lands are comprehensively planned, which means that if there's a 20-acre site, then they have to look at the whole site, not just sort of put something here and then come back for something later. That there's a public engagement process and that's a requirement or a requirement that council or the development officer can ask for a traffic or noise study. So it's not a way of getting around land use bylaw. It's actually a way of council requiring more detailed information than the land use bylaw would ever ask for.
Thanks, Crystal. I have this person says, I have some concerns with the coastal hazard map. I have a property I'm developing now with the new coastal hazard that runs through my property. Will that affect my ongoing work? And also, how do we know where the exact borderline is? The map is really vague, sorry.
So right now, the regulations are not in effect, these regulations. So if you get a permit before first reading, then you can proceed with your development as you've envisioned it. So it will be the responsibility of the property owner to get a qualified if there's any dispute. So in some cases, it's pretty, it might be clear where the property owner is going to be putting the structure on the site and it's nowhere close. But if it appears like it's close or in the coastal hazard area, then the property owner will have to hire a qualified person to find where that line is and then build outside of it. So that will be a piece of information that will have to be provided to the municipality. And if you want to get into the specifics of your site, what I would suggest is that you book a meeting with me or give me a call and we can look at the map together and I can answer your specific questions. But generally, that's how it's going to work if council adopts this provision.
And this person is asking if you can elaborate more on the housing issue, mini homes, small homes, and regulations.
Not entirely sure what we're talking about there, but if the question is related to travel trailers cannot be used as a permanent dwelling.
Okay, off of that then, what if you have a trailer already on property? Will that be grandfathered in or does it need to be moved?
So travel trailers under the current regulations can't be used as permanent dwellings. So if you have somebody living year round without a septic, and mostly it's a building code issue because they're not meant to live in year round, and there's safety issues about it being a year round structure. In some cases, people have tried to put wood stoves or alternate heat sources in there. It's just not something that can be permitted and get a building permit for safety. So those situations, we can look at each individually, and it depends on the nature of it. And there's a lot of specifics, but it's not just the bylaw you have to meet, but also the National Building Code requirements as well. And the building inspector would be involved in those discussions. So if you have a specific situation you'd like to talk about, we can run that. The building inspector and myself can sit down and we can discuss it with you.
Okay, I have a couple questions here. So why wouldn't we as a municipality ask for the maximum setback for wind turbines when we can get to protect land, residents, and future development? Is cost to developers, building roads, cost of transporting construction material, et cetera, taken into this decision?
Well, I guess I'm not sure, I'm not quite clear on that last. Developers pay for development, so the municipality doesn't consider the developer's costs, if that's what that is saying. But in terms of the setback, the municipality can set the setback at whatever it wants to, but there has to be some limit and reasonableness to it. And I think the other piece of this is how does the province play into all of this? So our documents, these draft documents, has been sent to the province for preliminary comment to see if there's any feedback they would like to provide on any of the provisions, and probably most importantly the wind turbine, to see what that could be. So at this point, what's being proposed is what appears reasonable given other best practices, what's going on in Nova Scotia, and what we understand the impacts of a potential wind farm, recognizing that the environmental assessment also is another layer of regulatory oversight that's here, and where the main regulatory oversight rests.
We've answered all of the questions posted.
So I just want to let people know that all these comments are logged. We've recorded this. We have all the questions, or if there's been other comments that you've provided into the question and answer, these will be summarized and provided to council. And a more detailed accounting, we keep an issue log where we log all the comments as well. And you will see a new draft in the next few weeks. Well, I guess the beginning of March, which is sooner than it seems possible. And then council will decide how it wants to proceed next, with the first step in the process being, as I mentioned, the potential first reading sometime in March. So thank you everyone for attending. And if you do want to have a one-on-one meeting, please reach out to me at this email address. Myself or my colleague Ning will respond to you if we can do it through email, or if we need a meeting, we can do that. Thank you.